Over the past few weeks, there's been loads of changes to multiple classes across the beta, but there's one role in particular that gets me excited, and I know it gets the guest of this video extremely excited, so I wanted to get his thoughts and his ideas around some of these classes, and ultimately answer what is going to be the right healer for you to play in Mr. Pandaria Classic. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Doublezug. How are you doing?
Great. How are you? Pretty excited about all these changes, so it's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, there is tons to talk about. Before we even get really into all of the classes, what is the one that you've been most excited about so far?
For me, I think it's Mistweaver. I really like how the spec played even previous to these changes, and I think the changes that Mistweaver got make like the most fun playstyle in my opinion, which is the fist weaving, like high uptime, high damage playstyle, just feel a lot better. So I'm super excited about Mistweaver, but honestly, pretty much all the healers except Resto Druid got changes that I think are overall really good for the game. You know, Holy Paladin's probably a close second. I think Holy Paladin changes are really good. Those are my top two, I'd say.
Yeah, I wish I had something else different to say to that, because they're mine as well, literally in order. The Mistweaver I've been doing a lot on the last couple of days, only really Celestial Dungeons, but I didn't really get to do a great deal after when they done the second lot of changes, and Mistweaver got, you know, the mana reduction and everything else, and it feels so good.
Yeah, your basic filler is like almost free. It's incredible. It feels amazing. And I mean, in 5-mans, like you said, you're doing mostly 5-mans and not raid. Mistweaver is so fun in 5-mans. Your damage is just absolutely insane, and these changes just improve that and make your healing better. So really, like every angle, Mistweaver.
What we're going to go over are the key changes to each spec, each healer, I should say, not spec, and that's going to be the changes that have been implemented by Blizzard recently. Tuning, not changes from Cataclysm to Mr. Pandaria. If you want to know about those changes, I'll put a link to Doublezug's YouTube channel in the description below. You can go over to his channel. He's done videos on all of those, you know, the changes to all the healers from Cataclysm to Mr. Pandaria, so you can go find them there. Instead, we're focusing on the tuning changes that Blizzard have done. We're also going to talk about if any of the healers need more changes or if they're fine as they are. And then we're going to rate the healers as well, which you've got to remember is going to be very subjective, very opinionated. They may differ between myself and Doublezug. He might rate a specific class higher than I do, but again, it will still give you a little bit of an idea around them because we'll give some justification. And then finally, there is a giveaway active on this video. So you're looking for 2 quotes in this. So there's going to be 2 winners. So at some point during this, Doublezug is going to drop in a famous quote from a movie, and so am I. If you guess 1, guess 2, whatever, just get them in the comments and a random winner will be picked. Well, 2 random winners will be picked next week. Where would you like to start, Double?
You want to start with Resto Shaman?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so Resto Shaman got only one set of changes in the first round, and I think, it was very clear that there's 2 really like bad guys in terms of needing to be nerfed, and that's Resto Shaman and Disc Priest. They were just way out of range with the other healers. Resto Shaman in terms of HPS, but also bringing really good utility and cooldowns and stuff. And Discipline Priest kind of just being insane in almost every way. So Resto Shaman got some nerfs here. There's really 3 main categories of nerfs. The first one is directed towards Healing Rain. Healing Rain, if you'll be familiar with it if you played Cataclysm, it's a very powerful ground-based AoE effect. In MoP, it's even more powerful, and it was just really, really, really strong, incredibly strong compared to like other healers' AoE abilities. So it definitely needed to be nerfed, and they definitely did nerf it. It got like a 25% reduction. Also, a talent that works with it got nerfed slightly, but really the main thing here is that 25% reduction. Pretty significant, but Healing Rain is still incredibly powerful. And a good thing to notice here is that Conductivity was not nerfed enough that you won't play it, and Conductivity makes the spec feel a lot more fun and like less annoying to play. So if you're worried about, going back to Cata days where Healing Rain is super annoying to cast every 10 seconds, we're definitely not in that world. The other 2 nerfs we got, one is a slight nerf to our filler spells. So Chain Hail and Riptide, the things we're going to be spending a lot of our mana on in between casting our cooldowns and stuff. Those were very slightly nerfed, but really not hugely significant in my opinion. Still great spells. You're not going to feel weak when you're casting those abilities. They're just more in line with other healers' filler now. The third change here is Ancestral Guidance did get nerfed very significantly. And this was really mostly targeted, I think, at DPS shamans off healing, which was very powerful, especially in things like challenge modes, but even in raid. Overall, I think it's really good to nerf that hybrid off healing for healer players specifically, because it's kind of lame if you have to play 3 or 4 healers and you can make up your entire role just with a couple of shamans pressing ancestral guidance at the right time. So I think this was overall good, but this does make this talent basically dead for Resto Shaman outside of like very specific fights where maybe you'll take it. So a little bit of a downside there. However, it's on the same row as conductivity and rushing streams, and those talents are both pretty fun and pretty good to use. So I don't think overall this is really that much of a nerf to Resto Shaman. You're not really going to feel it, honestly. Those are the 3 main categories of nerfs. Overall, the spec definitely suffers, but the fact, again, that it was so far ahead of all the other healers means we're still in a really great spot as Resto Shamans. Still really strong HPS. Your healing rate is still incredible. Your filler is still pretty good. You have really great CDs, and we, of course, bring some free damage with things like Stormlash, our fire elementals, and our utility is just like pretty incredible. So honestly, Resto Shaman could get much more severe nerfs, and you'd still take one of them in a 25, and they'd still be a great option for 10. So we're not dooming here. Resto Shaman is definitely not dead. I still think it's like one of the best, if not the best, all-around healers.
And when it comes to ancestral guidance, was there many situations that you would use ancestral guidance anyway? So obviously it's a big nerf to the talent, but is it something that will be missed in certain circumstances, you think, or is it more just kind of whatever?
Not really. It's very minor, very situational. You have so many throughput cooldowns as a shaman, and they're so powerful anyways that like putting another 2 minute on the spec really wasn't that big of a deal. The cooldown was like so insanely powerful before that a lot of it was overhealing. So some of the nerf is not hugely significant, but really like this won't change or diminish the spec's like viability in raid at all. And even in dungeons, like you probably would just take the healing stream totem talent anyway. So it's worth mentioning, but it's not like something that's going to hurt the spec tremendously.
Okay, well, let's go on to, the opposite of Shaman, really. Yeah, the Paladin. Because I think the Paladin one is a super interesting one. When it comes to healing, I'm not really a meta chaser. Even though Resto Shaman is, super, super powerful, it still wouldn't be the healer that I would choose to play personally. Because, well, when we get on to the end topic, when we're talking about what healer's right for each kind of person sort of thing, yeah, it's not right for me. It's very bland, I think, the playstyle of Resto Shaman. But Holy Paladin, on the other hand, do you want to talk us through what humongous buffs they've got? And I don't even think it's unfair to say that or exaggerating. I really do think it's tremendous buffs.
Oh yeah, they're huge, and it's not even just the throughput buffs. There's some like kind of sleeper ones in there that people might not have noticed or might not think are super important, but that are actually like incredibly impactful. So like the first thing that I want to talk about is just the throughput stuff. So the main buffs to our healing are going to be in the form of mana. So the first changes we got, Seal of Insight, restoring 4% of total mana, which I think it was like 12,000 mana per melee hit. This was so incredibly powerful that as long as you were in melee some of the time, you basically had infinite mana. And so the second round of changes, they did kind of scale this back a little bit. They almost divided the mana you get from Seal of Insight by 4. But even with that crazy of a nerf, it's still incredibly powerful. Holy Paladin is going to feel really, really amazing in terms of its mana. Kind of similar to the Mistweaver changes, right? Where these specs that previously you would have had to be very careful, you wouldn't really have high uptime. Now, Holy Paladin is going to feel amazing to play. And of course, you're also getting a lot of healing from that extra mana. So that's like the major throughput change. The other thing to mention here is that Crusader Strike was kind of designed initially around this seal existing and giving you mana. So before we got these buffs, when Seal of Insight didn't give you mana, your Crusader Strike wasn't even really worth casting. Over the course, we've gotten a couple of little small iterative changes to Crusader Strike. The end result of this is that it's pretty good. It's a pretty good spell to cast. It's very mana efficient, and it's a really nice buff to Eternal Flame as well, because Selfless Healer playstyle previously was really good. And now Eternal Flame has Crusader Strike versus Judgment, so it's a lot more mana efficient, and it makes the two playstyles much closer. So overall, the mana changes are going to be really, really good for play pattern and like fun. And also, Holy Paladin now with these mana changes does very competitive and good HPS, especially given how much of its HPS is in absorbs, which are obviously like super effective. The other two changes I want to mention here that are like, actually, first let's talk about Eternal Flame. So Eternal Flame was the first thing they changed, which is it's like your hot that replaces Word of Glory. And a lot of people were super excited about this, turning paladin into a hot healer. But previous to the buff it got, which is that they've made it scale with mastery again, which was something they reverted in like 5.4, it just wasn't comparable to the other playstyle Selfless Healer, which is based around pressing judgment. And so it would have been pretty disappointing for a lot of people, I think, if they remembered back in the day spamming this hot around the whole raid, covering the whole raid and absorbs. That really was not viable. And the change of putting mastery back on Eternal Flame, plus all the changes to both mana and buffing Crusader Strike, make that playstyle very, very viable and comparable to Selfless Healer. So I think, again, another big buff to like both HPS and fun. Lastly, there's two changes I mentioned before that are like kind of sleeper changes that you might not think of as being incredibly important, but that really are incredibly important, and that's Devotion Aura and the melee mechanic thing. So firstly, Devotion Aura now affects all damage. So it's not just magic damage. This is really, really incredible, especially for something like a 10-man where your cooldowns being flexible is super important. This is just a huge buff to like Holy Paladin's utility, and it also gives their cooldown an advantage over just like a Prot Pally or a Ret Pally's cooldown. So that's a really huge one. And lastly here, the melee mechanics thing. If you Crusader Strike, for 20 seconds after you Crusader Strike, you cannot be targeted by ranged mechanics. And this is just really, really nice quality of life, especially given that after the Seal of Insight changes, we really want to be in melee, hitting the boss, hitting our Crusader Strike, getting mana back. And so being able to do that without trolling your raid by dropping a wind bomb in the melee stack or whatever, it's really, really incredible, both quality of life and also like HPS, right?
The reason I like the way they've done it is because if you've got an ability that's got a set amount of range that you need to be out, and you've got, potentially one of those range is a Holy Paladin that you trust, to handle a mechanic, you've kind of got the choice now, haven't you? You've got the choice between having your Holy Paladin be out and manage a mechanic or go in and avoid mechanics. So it's like, I think it's quite a clever way to do it where like the raid or the raid leader or the Paladin himself, is in control whether he wants to deal with specific mechanics or not.
Yeah, if you want to have your Holy Paladin bait something in 10-man or whatever, you can absolutely choose it up, which is really cool. And it's something that's common across a lot of these changes, which is just that they seem to be like very cleverly done, and like there seems to be a lot of attention to detail and like thought behind these changes, which across everything, which is really, really good. Especially like all these healer changes are way better than I expected, way more than I ever expected. So it's definitely really, really encouraging, especially compared to what we got with Cataclysm.
We got heroics called Inferno dungeons that just doubled the amount of health they've got. That was what we got in Cataclysm. Again, look, I don't want to focus on the negatives, but the Crusader Strike had, through the passive that you get for being a Holy Paladin, it's had 7.5% hit added as well. So you're just hit capped with Crusader Strike. But I'm assuming that's not expertise capping you, so you can still be dodged even if you're hitting the boss from behind, right?
Yeah, this is something that I was actually going to bring up in terms of the healers need anything extra. It's just feels bad to have a 7% chance to be dodged on your Crusader Strike. I would much rather they put expertise cap on it and just nerf its mana cost by 10% or 7% or whatever, than have that just random chance for it not to work. It just feels bad, and it's a little bit inconsistent, right? Like Mistweaver gets hit and expertise cap from their spirit. The other healers get free hit cap on their damaging spells just passively, and for some reason Holy Paladin has this weird interaction. So yeah, that's something I would add, is just make it expertise cap.
You're going to waste the mana by using it if it dodges, but you're also not going to get the holy power, which, yeah, it's just not going to feel good. So they're kind of halfway there, aren't they? They've gave it the hit chance. Now it just needs the expertise as well.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not worth casting without the expertise cap. It's still good. It's just a feeling, quality of life thing. Like, I'd much rather they even, put the expertise back on, but you could even lower the mana cost so that's not actually a buff to Crusader Strike. That it's just a feeling thing. Especially if you're going to use a cooldown like Holy Avenger, where every single generator now generates 3. If you're pressing Crusader Strike inside that cooldown and you dodge and you don't get your 3 holy power, that feels pretty bad, right? So I think that's like one of the changes I'd recommend for HPAL.
But let's move on to changes for...
Oh, do you want to get Resto Druid out of the way? Because it's basically nothing.
Yeah, go for it.
Resto Druid just was the least changed healer by a lot, and they basically just got 5% or above. They're passive that increases all their healing from 10 to 15%. So not a lot of like interesting stuff to talk about here, but I'll just say I think the reason why they didn't get changed is because it was probably like their balancing target to nerf/buff the other healers to be about as good as Resto Druid, because previous to this, Resto Druid was, I think, the most balanced healer. It was pretty good at everything. It had decent cooldowns, pretty good utility, pretty good at healing, and a little bit of passive damage as well, and some active damage. So all around, like a very balanced spec. And the one thing I'll say though is that I think with the changes that a lot of the other healers have gotten, Resto Druid might be falling a little bit behind because the other specs are just buffed further beyond Resto Druid a little bit, I think. So could be a target for some small buffs next few weeks before launch.
You're right. And I think it's even less about output and all of that and more just about, well, all the other healers are getting some fun stuff to get excited about. And then the Resto Druid is just there with his extra 5% healing. Like, oh, this is great.
As a Resto Druid, you're kind of relying on like the Druid DPS and tank specs being bad enough that you are taken for Druid utility. And that's a pretty bad feeling as a healer, to just kind of hope that you're taken because other Druid specs are even worse.
Yeah.
Not that Resto Druid's bad at all. It's just, again, some of the other healers that were worse than it got buffed, and those buffs were pretty significant. So Resto Druid not getting touched means that just by definition, it's going to be a little bit behind, right? So,
all right, but that's Resto Druid. Let's do Disc Priest. Well, I mean, let's do Priest.
So I'm going to start with Disc here. So if you're a very big Disc enjoyer, you might be saying, look at how they massacred my boy. You might be dooming. You know, you're in the pit of despair. You're weeping. You're posting in the forums crying. And that is sort of legitimate. We did get really, really serious nerfs to Disc Priest. But the thing is, the spec was so incredibly overpowered before that, you know, these kinds of severe nerfs were 100% necessary to make it so that you took any other healer. If you played, you know, on private servers, you played an original mob in Siege of Orgrimmar in 5.4. You know, if you've been watching some of my videos where I glaze this spec and say how incredible it is, you might have been excited to play this super overpowered spec, but honestly, I think this is for the best. It's much more fun overall for all the healers to be balanced and for it to be like possible to take not just Resto Shaman and Disc Priest. So I think a lot of this dooming is definitely overstated, and the spec is still in a great spot. It still has a lot of the strengths. It's just now not the best at every single thing in the game by far. There's a couple of categories of nerfs here. The first thing is that we had our Atonement nerfed, and it was a pretty significant nerf. Our damaging spells went from doing 90% of the damage they deal as healing to 70%. So it's like about a 22% nerf. This is really significant for our like just average HPS. But the purpose of this, I think, is mostly to make it so that we have to make decisions about what spells to cast. We still want to press our Penance and our Holy Fire on cooldown, but instead of always just pressing Smite, now we're going to be more encouraged to sometimes press defensive spells like Prayer of Healing, Binding Heal, etc., instead of just always mindlessly spamming Smite. So while this Atonement nerf is definitely a nerf, it was definitely necessary, and it also will improve the playstyle, I think. So overall, good change. We also had Divine Star reduced by 25%, and meaningfully, this is only for Discipline. This does not affect Holy Priest. Again, I think this was totally necessary, especially given that they reversed the nerf to all the 90 row talents that made them capped again. So even a 25% reduced Divine Star is still really, really good, especially in those 25-man scenarios where you're hitting like 10, 15, 20 targets with your Divine Star. This spell is still incredible, but with that 25% nerf for Discipline, it just means that it's not like completely disgustingly broken anymore. The last thing that they did was, in order to compensate for a lot of these buffs, actually first, Divine Aegis got nerfed, which is our crit like multiplier effect. So Discipline, whenever you crit heal, instead of the heal doing more, it just doubles that effect and gives you all absorb, and then that's multiplied by your mastery. So there's some like double dipping in there. This Divine Aegis nerf is like not as significant as it looks. It's definitely an HPS reduction, but again, this effect is so incredibly powerful because of how broken absorb healing is. Even with this significant of a nerf, it's still really, really good, and we still do generate a huge amount of absorb. So those are like the two nerfs to our filler, right? Atonement and Divine Aegis. Totally like reasonable. I don't think they were too much. I don't think they really need to be reverted more than they already have been. And last of all, we got one little sort of lonely buff in all this sea of nerfs, and that's that Spirit Shell had its duration increase from 10 all the way to 15 seconds. So that's a pretty significant duration increase. This is really, really good. It's going to shift our healing profile away from, again, just kind of mindlessly spamming smite to generate smart healing towards being more focused with active absorb generation and preempting damage, pressing your spirit shell at the right time to cover the raid with prayer of healing, or using that spirit shell to do really effective tank healing. Just a really positive change for like the playstyle of Discipline Priest. So what does this all add up to? Well, Discipline Priest is going to be probably like the lowest in terms of its overall healing output, but it still has all the strengths it used to have, right? It still does really good damage. It still has incredible utility and cooldowns. It's still like super tanky, and it still generates so much absorb healing, way more than all the other specs, right? Even Holy Paladin. And that's still incredibly valuable. So now instead of getting all those benefits for free, we just have to pay a little bit of a price in terms of overall HPS. So I think the spec is still in a really good spot, and all the doomers and the people crying, maybe it's a little bit overstated. I think Discipline Priest is still very, very strong.
Yeah, everything that you've said, 100% right. They're still really strong in their own right. Disc Priest and Resto Shaman, where they were just miles and ahead as the two strongest healers, like they've still got arguably the best toolkit, but yeah, they've had to suffer a little bit for that in sort of the output area.
Yeah, and meaningfully, they didn't get their damage or utility nerfed, and those are kind of the strongest points of the healer anyway. It's just now you have to pay a price for those things instead of just getting them attached to also the highest HPS that also is all absorbed. So really the only downside to these changes, I think, is that you won't get to experience how disgustingly overpowered the spec was, which can be kind of fun sometimes, but in terms of its overall effect on the game, it's definitely good.
And then the big one, the Holy Priest.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. Got some significant changes. Ironically, the biggest change to the Holy Priest is not something you'll find in the Holy Priest changes section. It's that Disc was nerfed because, of course, Holy Priest is on the same class as Discipline, and previous to these changes, Discipline was just better than it by a lot in every single way. It had access to all the same 90-row talents, all the same, talents otherwise, and doing a bunch of healing in absorbs is just better than hots, right? So Holy Priest just did less damage, had less good cooldowns, and also did less healing and in a worse kind of profile. So the fact that Disc is now pretty low in terms of its overall HPS and has its Divine Star nerfed, as well as, the scaling with critical strike and stuff like that nerf, means that Holy Priest has an opportunity to actually be better than Discipline Priest some of the time. And that's like, really, really nice, especially if you're a player who likes to swap between specs. I think that's going to be something you will be doing even more so than just on Sulong now. But let's go into the changes here. So there's really not that many changes, honestly. It's mostly two things. The first thing, well, actually, the biggest thing was that they reverted the target cap on Divine Star, Halo, and Cascade. If they hadn't reverted that, Holy Priest would have been hugely, hugely harmed by that, even more so than Discipline Priest, in my opinion. So those remaining uncapped is incredible for Holy. The second thing is that our Divine Hymn now just hits every single player, every single pet, every single friendly in the raid with every tick. And that's really, really powerful, right? Divine Hymn is not just powerful because it does healing, it also puts a 10% healing increase on everyone it hits. And so getting 100% uptime on that on the whole raid is incredible. Also, like, in 25 man, it hitting all 25 players. Holy Priest scales up really, really well with like target counts. It makes our throughput cooldown just a lot better. The fact that, we don't have barrier and stuff like that is a little bit made up for by the fact that him is now super powerful. The other change that we got to our throughput is we got our chakras buffed by 10% from 25% amp to 35% amp. This is just a nice little change to juice up our filler spells a little bit. Our Prayer of Healing, our Circle of Healing, Prayer of Mending, all that stuff is going to be, 10% stronger. However, meaningfully, this affects our 90-row talents. So things like Divine Star, Halo, and Cascade do get this chakra healing effect. And again, this gives us a strength over Discipline, where because Discipline has their Divine Star nerfed by 25% and we have ours buffed by 35%, our Divine Star is 60% stronger than a Discipline Priest. So in those situations where you're in a 25-man raid and the whole raid is like pixel stacked and you're taking a bunch of damage, think something like Ultraxian. In that situation, Holy Priest does the most healing of any healer, and it's like by a lot. Because Divine Star being uncapped is like so broken that just casting your Divine Star on cooldown, for example, is going to be doing almost as much healing as a second healer.
that would be really useful. Well, even if a 25-man, stone guard, just as soon as you walk into Mogoshon Vaults week 1, if you're just stacking the dogs and then, using raid cooldowns. Yeah, I mean, a holy priest will just be carrying every explosion.
Yeah, it is, the amount of healing it does is really incredible. And there's really not a lot of stuff that is uncapped. Like, I'm trying to think of things. It's basically just the priest 90 row stuff. So Halo, Divine Star, Chi Torpedo is uncapped. And I think
Revival
part of the Resto Druid Bloom is uncapped. Revival, yeah. But like, there's really not that much stuff that actually scales up with target counts for healers. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a unique niche that Holy Priest has. Discipline Priest, obviously still does get Divine Star, but their Divine Star is just significantly weaker. So I think Holy Priest is going to shine on those fights. Discipline Priests may potentially be swapping to Holy for some fights like that, even in like 100% competitive top end guilds. So that's a good time for Holy Priest. I think in 10-man, they're a little bit weaker just because 10-man, there's not 25 players. And if you can't hit more than 10 players, like, your scaling isn't going to work quite the same way. The last thing to mention for Holy Priest is kind of a big change, mostly quality of life though for raid, which is that your chakra went from a 30-second cooldown to a 10-second cooldown. So chakras are kind of like stances for warrior, where there's a single target one, an AoE one, and a damage one. And basically in raid, you're going to always be in the AoE one just because the AoE spells are way better than the single target spells. But what this change does is it just makes it a lot easier to swap between them because the cooldown isn't super long. And so this is going to increase our damage because it will allow us to go into red easily when there's like a burn phase or downtime and do some damage. And it's also going to allow us to more easily swap into single target and do some spot or tank healing. However, again, in raid, the AoE chakra is so much better. And it also, the AoE chakra buffs all of your 90 row stuff. So you're really not going to be spending much time in single target. I think mostly what this change does is allow us to do a little bit more damage, which is nice for the spec to, again, make it a little bit more competitive with Discipline Priest, which does a lot of damage. The one thing that I potentially think about doing is buffing the single target chakra a little bit more in raid. If they want to have 2 separate playstyles that are viable, they definitely need to buff the single target chakra a lot compared to AoE, because again, the AoE spells are just way, way better than, pressing flash heal or binding heal, even if you're refreshing renews. The single target chakra playstyle just really doesn't work. However, it's fine to just leave it the way it is. I think the AoE playstyle is like still pretty fun, and you don't need to have that single target be viable. It just might be an interesting like design space for them to mess around with.
Mana has always been a concern. What's that like at the moment? Because you said about going into red chakra to actually do damage. Like, can your mana pool actually manage that?
Well, that's the thing. The red chakra reduces the mana cost of all your damage spells by like 90%. So previously you couldn't really do damage because if you wanted to swap into red, you have to be in there for 30 seconds, which is like a long, long time. And if you use your damage spells outside of that, they were really expensive. But if you go into red, now you have 10 seconds of basically free. Like, they cost like your smite costs 1,000 mana or something. You regen way more than that. So it's effectively, it's pretty much free. So the chakra thing, it's just a really nice quality of life. I don't think it's really going to increase your healing that much, but it will make the spec feel better to play, and it'll make doing damage on the spec feel a lot better, which I think is a good thing overall.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. As I say, I've played a lot of MOP and a lot of classes, but I can honestly say the only time I've ever been holy is on Sulong. That's it.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever used the red chakra, so I didn't even know what it done.
Yeah. You wouldn't use it on Sulong, that's for sure.
Okay, cool. And then that leaves us with my favorite spec. So the Mistweaver.
Yeah, so Mistweaver has huge litany of changes. There's a lot of them. They're kind of complicated. But basically what it comes down to is that they made fist weaving, which is the word for, going in there and pressing jab and tiger palm and blackout kick in melee to do smart healing. They made that playstyle the best playstyle. They made it viable, and they made the mana feel way, way, way more comfortable. So previously you could fist weave to a certain extent, but you had to be very careful with your mana, and you couldn't have like 100% uptime. You couldn't be in there fully spamming your jab and your tiger palm every single global. What they did is they reduced the mana cost of jab significantly. They made your mana T, which is what you get stacks of as you spend your chi. They made that restore significantly more mana. So it used to restore 4% per stack. Now it restores 5%. You also get more of that with your crit, kind of similar to how the Windwalker Mastery worked previous to the changes, where your Mastery made you sometimes proc extra stacks. Crit does that. And so in terms of like gearing stuff in phase 1 BIS, with just that amount of crit rating, your filler on a Mistweaver, your melee filler, which is spamming Jab and Tiger Palm, is going to be basically free, which is pretty incredible. It gives you a huge amount of mana to play with for things like potentially using Glyph of Uplift, spot healing, spamming. So it's the main change is just that they made fist weaving like basically not just viable but the best playstyle. The second thing they did, which I think is actually pretty important, is they nerfed Crackling Jade Lightning's damage. They didn't nerf its healing. They actually increased its healing a little bit because they increased the healing of your smart healing from damage, which is called Eminence. They increased that significantly. But previous to this, there was actually like a really kind of degenerate playstyle where if you wanted to maximize your damage, for the most part, you would just be spamming Crackling Jade Lightning the entire fight. And you can actually see some of this if you look back into old logs on Warcraft logs from Siege of Orgrimmar. You can see the number one DPS parses for Mistweaver are like 80% of their damage is just Crackling Jade Lightning. And that's like really not that fun of a playstyle. It's, you know, it's really not that exciting to just sit 20 yards away from the boss and spam your little green Sith Lightning the entire fight. So kind of making that not as good damage-wise, but still leaving Crackling Jade Lightning as an option for ranged damage and healing if you are forced out of melee is a really good thing. The last change they did was they re-added Glyph of Uplift, which was in at the beginning of the game and was very cheap. It basically just transforms your uplift from something that costs chi to just a button that costs mana that you can spam. But the version they gave us costs 10% of base mana, so it's a little bit of a medium between the original, I think, was like 6%, and then they nerfed it to 16% because it was way too powerful. So we kind of landed in the middle here, and I think the mana cost is in a pretty good spot where this glyph is not going to be overpowered by any means, but as we scale up in terms of gear and mana, we're going to have another option of playstyle where we can take this glyph and we can, instead of using chi on uplift, we can spam our uplift with mana. I think the changes landed it in a really, really good spot where mana is going to feel amazing. You're going to have really high uptime with your fist weaving abilities. It's going to feel really fun. You're going to feel like you're playing a really active melee DPS. And there's a lot of viable playstyles, a lot of viable talents. They just landed in a really good spot. I think going forward, if they do change the spec, they should just do kind of like aura nerfs and not any radical changes because they did end up in such a good spot, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. It feels absolutely fantastic to play. And I mean, I'm always going to say that because it's a monk, but you know, like it feels, how it is now feels better to me than Mistweaver in retail. And I love Mistweaver in retail, but some people will like to have to think about their mana. But we was having to think about it far too much as Mistweavers. Like I said on that Countdown to Classic podcast, I got through MSV week 1 as a Mistweaver just fine, you know, and I was getting to Fist Weave. But I was getting to Fist Weave to about 20% mana and then being like, oh, I better stop. And that feels bad. You know, having to stop feels bad because then it's like, you know, having to stand there and actually do some proper healing, generate as much chi and spend as much as you can to then start using mana tea. You know, now it just feels, yeah, it feels fantastic. The one thing as well, when you said about like talents, you know, all of the talents are viable, which yes, like, you know, you'll be changing talents on a fight by fight basis, but even glyphs, you know, with these changes, especially the mana tea changes, like I've never been a fan of Glyph of Mana tea, like ever, you know, even when back in original Mist of Pandaria, when it was like, you know, being theory crafted that it you know, it's the way to go. You know, the most optimal way to heal was to use Glyph of Mana tea. I've never liked it. You know, I much prefer to use my mana tea, you know, at natural downtimes during the fight. So on a phase transition or when a boss goes immune or, you know, you just get those moments, don't you, where you can just stand there and just chug your tea to get your mana back full. And for anyone listening, obviously, Glyph of Mana tea, it gives your mana tea a 10-second cooldown, but you consume 2 charges instantly. Whereas without the glyph, you have to stand there and drink, essentially. But with the mana tea now giving 5%, you know, you're getting 10% of your mana back every 10 seconds, potentially, if you want to use it on cooldown. And when you're doing so much fist weaving, I think it actually feels amazing now. And again, I'm a Glyph of Manatee hater, so the fact that I'm enjoying it, is saying something.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? It takes a global, and with how cheap our like jab target bomb filler is, we're actually like we really want our globals to do damage with. But the thing is, like, if you sit the manatee, you're losing those globals anyways. So on fights where there's not, like you said, natural downtime where the boss goes immune or whatever, I do think you probably will be playing the glyph, and it doesn't like cancel your auto attack or anything, so you can still be punching the boss, which is obviously good value. But yeah, I think just overall, Mistweaver is like in an incredible spot. I also do agree that I think it's more fun than the retail version. I like the cheese system. I think it is kind of a bummer when they removed that on retail, and it just feels super super smooth with these mana changes.
Okay, that's all. So that's all the healer changes, or tune in, or however you want to call it. So let's go on to the next point, which is: do any of the healers need more? Do any of the healers need just anything? Like, do they need less? Do they need nerfing down? Do they need buffing up? What's your thoughts around any of them? We haven't got to go through all of them. If we think, from my perspective, I kind of feel like Resto, Shaman, Disc Priest have landed in a good spot. I think Mistweaver's landed in a good spot. I think Holy Paladin's landed in a good spot. I'll be honest with you, for me personally, outside of them doing any sort of more radical changes, with like externals, so having more damage reduction or healing amp raid cooldowns to make some of the other specs stand out a little bit more, which, that could be a little bit too far and no chance that's going to happen. It really only is the Resto Druid I would look at.
Yeah, I basically agree. Like, the only thing I had written down for Resto Shaman, Disc HPAL, and Mistweaver was just the expertise change on Crusader Strike, which you mentioned already. I don't think those healers really need a touch. I think Resto Shaman actually could easily survive more HPS nerfs. I just don't think you need to do them because that spec is just so strong outside of its HPS. But I do agree, like, basically the two healers that I think might need more touching are Resto Druid and Holy Priest. Like you're saying, you could do some kind of like more transformative stuff with their cooldowns. Give them like, a comparable DR cooldown or something. But if they aren't willing to do that, maybe just a small buff to their filler, buff rejuve. They could also, buff like the treants to make them a little bit more competitive or something. And for Holy Priest, again, as I said before, I think the AoE Chakra playstyle is in a really good spot. I think it does really high HPS. It has a niche where it's really good, which is that stacked up raid healing. And they just have to decide whether or not they want to make the single target chakra like a playable and viable like playstyle where you could sit in that chakra the whole fight and go around refreshing renews and spamming flash heal and binding heal and stuff like that. Because if they want to do that, it would require kind of like a redesign of the whole chakra. But I think it might kind of be a can of worms, and maybe it's a little bit too optimistic to think they're going to do that. But the last thing I will say though is that I think it would be really good if they could buff Divine Insight on Holy Priest, which is the talent where when you cast Prayer of Healing or Greater Heal, you have a 40% chance to proc like an instant palm. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be really cool if they could find some way to buff that to make it more competitive with Twist of Fate, because it's a really cool and fun talent. And it's pretty unique, right? Getting instant cast palms that bounce instantly. Like, it just feels really good to press. The sound effect of palm is fun. It's just a more fun talent than Twist of Fate, in my opinion. So some kind of buff to that, maybe giving it a passive that like increases your serendipity effect or something, would be good. So those are the things I'll mention for Holy Priest. But overall, again, I think the buffs and the nerfs landed in a pretty good spot. Definitely way better than I ever expected for the healer balancing here.
I was kind of blown away by the fact that they done anything to the healers. When they started balancing the DPS, I thought maybe they'd do something with tanks, but I didn't think that they would do a great deal to healers. But then it was Paladin mainly. When they done the first round of Paladin buffs, I was like, yeah, Blizzard. Just when I think you couldn't be any dumber, you go and do something like that and totally redeem yourself. That's literally how I was. I was just looking at them thinking, you've already messed up the meta when it comes to DPS, and then you completely redeemed yourself by going, balls deep on one of the most hated healers in MOP. And it really is, isn't it? For anybody that knew anything of private servers or people who played on private servers, everybody was dooming on Holy Paladin. If you're a Holy Paladin, reroll Shaman. Like, it was the one healer spec that, I don't know, I think almost had a plague around it, and everyone was going to actively avoid them. But I just think, honestly, I think they've done a great job. I don't normally sit and praise Blizzard, but with what they've done with Holy Paladin in particular, that's the one that stands out for me. Like, the others, great. Yeah, Holy Priest getting a bit of a buff. Resto Druid. I mean, Resto Druid. I don't even like to say it got a bit of a buff because it's neither here nor there, really. It would have survived just fine.
They got a consolation prize or something.
Yeah, that's literally what happened to them. Yeah, so I kind of wouldn't want to ask for more because I think they're all just in a pretty good place. Like, exactly as you said, with Paladins being able to get some expertise for Judgment Strike would be nice. I'd like to see how Holy Priest performs the weekend. Obviously, we've got raid testing this weekend. I think we've not actually got to see any of the recent changes in action, so I think the logs will speak 1,000 words, won't they? Once we get to see them at the end of the weekend.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool. Okay, so then just really quick, we can blast through this in 5-10 minutes. Rate the healers. So this is for everybody that's on the fence. They know they want to play a healer. They saw you was on this video and was like, right, this is where I'm going to get the answer. What do we think is going to be the meta? So what is going to be the most powerful comp of healers for both 10 and 25? In like gut feeling, we know we could be completely wrong, but what do you think is going to be the two go-to healers for a 10-man?
In 10-man, I still do think that Resto Shaman Disc is just a really incredible, flexible, powerful combo. I think, especially because people have the memory of that being meta, I think a lot of comps will just end up running Resto Shaman Disc, running that back. But I do think it's way closer in 10-man. I think HPAL has a pretty solid third in that list. HPAL is really, really good. It has absorbs, it has great cooldowns, great utility. Mistweaver, I think, is also up there, right? The damage that Mistweaver does is insane. And it lacks the cooldowns a little bit, which is a bit of a con in 10-man, but the damage and the healing it does is just really, really powerful. I think Resto Druid and Holy Priest are pretty solidly at the bottom of the list for 10-man. However, Resto Druid is it's still 100% serviceable. But again, it does kind of lack the CD flexibility, and the HPS is just a little bit lower than some of the other options, but the utility is really great. Also, 10-man gearing comes into play, and comp comes into play a lot more. So all the healers are close enough that if you want to make a choice for fun or for gear optimization or for getting a raid buff or something, you can bring any healer in 10-man, in my opinion, and it's just fine. What do you think about 10-man?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Yeah, Resto Shaman Disc Priest, I still think just due to the toolkit, it is, still the go-to. Would be my gut feeling. The only thing that I would love to get your opinion on is which one of them is the most important. So let's say somebody watching really, is a raid leader maybe, and they really want to run a Mistweaver. Which one of the healers is the one that you would replace out of the Resto Shaman and Disc Priest?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's pretty hard to answer. I think the main problem with having Disc Priest be your core healer is just that it doesn't do very much raw output in terms of HPS anymore with just its filler spells, unless you really prioritize prayer of healing and stuff like that. So it's hard to say. I think you probably just replace the disc with a Mistweaver. It's really interesting, and I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. Not a great answer, honestly, for me, but I think the healers are close enough now that it's pretty arguable. But I think the Resto Shaman, the 10% HP you get from Resto Shaman, is really powerful on progression. It has so many cooldowns. It has such high throughput, and you still get a little bit of damage. So I think Resto Shaman is kind of core, but the barrier and the spirit shell is so hard to replace. It's really hard to say. But if I was making a 10-man, I would build it around a Resto Shaman. But you could easily do it with Disc Priest. HPAL Mistweaver, and HPAL Mistweaver will do a very close approximation of Resto Shaman Disc Priest, right? You have a HPS healer, you have a DPS healer, and you have absorbs, you have throughput, you have pretty good cooldown. So there's a lot of comps that can work.
Yeah, that's kind of how I see it, especially with the change to the devotion aura for paladins, because I kind of put paladin and disc priest now as interchangeable because they both bring really good absorbs. Okay, the holy paladin don't bring the damage a disc priest does, but it's got the 20% damage reduction, so not quite as good as barrier, but it's there or thereabouts. Then you got hand of protections.
Well, it's better on some fights, right? If you can't stack.
Yeah, if you can't stack, yeah, absolutely.
It's way better.
Yep, absolutely, because there's no positional requirements. So, yeah, I would kind of clump them two together. I mean, Resto Shaman, I can't really put anything with it because its toolkit is so unique. Like you say, with a 10% HP that you just don't get from anywhere else. Spirit Link, yeah, it's really difficult to actually then say, oh, I would take this class instead of a Resto Shaman, because I don't think there is one, yeah, that I would want to take. But what a comp that I'd love to see, and one that I'm looking forward to running, probably not on a beta, but when it's live, would be Disc Priest Mistweaver. And even though that's a strange comp, that is some max DPS comp for 10 man.
Yeah, I think that could end up actually being meta because the DPS is so high, and Mistweaver does really good healing. It's the only real problem with it in 10 man is that it lacks the cooldown coverage, right? You just have revival. You can kind of do a little bit of something with like Glyph of Uplift and a Thunder Focus T reset. You can do some burst healing there, but like the problem with that is in 10 man, you don't have, you're not going to have a whole bunch of random warriors and rogues running around with Smoke Bomb and Banner and stuff like that. Whereas in 25 man, you can get away with having not as many cooldowns on your healers. But if you can get away with it, Mistweaver Disc is incredible, right? Because you get so much damage.
10 man is the hardest thing to try and get right, because you got an argument for all of them, haven't you? You kind of just want to take them all. Just run one tank and 5 healers.
Yeah, and that speaks to how much better the balance is, right? That there actually is an argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't have even considered a Holy Paladin, but I have really been on the fence, thinking, would we be better off with a Holy Paladin in one of our 10 mans? Because again, in Heart of Fear, there is lots of places that are really good for physical damage reduction cooldowns. Bops,
yeah, even things like Bop, right?
Yeah,
Bop is so powerful.
Yeah, wind steps on Blade Lord, like there's so many places that stuff can be used. So. Yeah, I think Paladin is actually going to have, in general, Rep, Prot, and Holy. Like, they're lucky boys at the moment, because I think Paladin's going to do really well.
100%. You want to talk about 25?
25, now? Yeah, go for it. Yeah, what do you think,
right,
how many healers are people are going to be running first as well? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think for MSV, you could go pretty low. We used to be able to get away with a lot more because Disc Priest, you could stack and it did really high HPS, but now Disc Priest HPS being a little bit lower, maybe you have to take an extra healer. But I think you're going to much more likely to be seeing 4 and 5 rather than 5 and 6, especially MSV. MSV feels like it does very little damage. Like you might even do 3 and 4 healing on some of those fights, especially in farm. But the strength and weaknesses I talked about for the 10 man list basically all apply to 25 man. The one difference is that, as I said before, in 25 you aren't as focused on getting cooldowns from your healers, right? Because you have a lot more DPS players you can get cooldowns from, and there's the same amount of damage events in 25 man as 10, so coverage isn't as hard. So that makes things like Mistweaver, Resto, Druid, Holy Priest go up a little bit compared to things like Disc, HPAL, and Arsham. But I think the actual ranking is very similar to 10 man, where I think Resto Shaman is still super core. There's basically 0% chance you see like a meta comp without a Resto Shaman. I think even the second Resto Shaman is still really good. The healer that I think is the most stackable. I think Disc, you probably are guaranteed to see like one of in the meta composition, but it's definitely not stackable anymore, in my opinion. I think Mistweaver is actually really, really strong now. I think instead of that like second or third Disc Priest, you just bring a Mistweaver. They do more damage, especially on AoE, and they do more healing, and you're just losing like a barrier and a spirit shell, right? So I think Resto Shaman, Disc, Mistweaver, the fourth slot could be a second Resto Shaman, it could be a second Mistweaver, it could be really anything. I think Holy Paladin, again, very strong utility, very strong cooldowns. If you don't want to bring a prop pally or a rep pally, I think you just automatically bring an H-Pal just to get the pops and stuff. And I think the bottom two spots are kind of like H-Priest, Resto, Druid, but all these healers are pretty close. I literally think there's a good argument to be made for just bringing one of every class. Like just bring a Shaman, a Disc, a Mistweaver, a Paladin, and a Resto Druid and have the rainbow composition. and then have your Disc Priest swap to Holy on some fights, right? Like Sulong and maybe a few others. So just the fact that you could argue for like one of every class to be the best comp is pretty interesting. But I do think that like the core is going to be Resto, Shaman, Disc, Mistweaver, and then the fourth slot is going to be like an extra Shaman or an extra Mistweaver, and then that fifth spot is just going to be whatever you flex. Potentially, you have like your flex be an Ellie Shaman, but I don't know how good like the other flexes are. Like if the Shadow Priest buffs are super significant, you could easily have like a Holy Priest / Disc Priest flex. That's what I'd say. But again, I think these comps are super open. Like there's nothing that's so obviously the best in my view that I would be comfortable saying that that's what like the racers are going to take or whatever. So
again, completely agree. I do think we'll see a lot of comps where it's like one Resto Shaman, one Disc, two Mistweavers, for example. Where it's just more damage. Like you said, there's not that much like threatening damage in MSV, so just having all that AoE and everything from the monks will be really strong.
I could definitely see double Mistweaver in MSV because there's just not that much damage, right? So having it's just kind of disgusting how good it is to have your healer do like 50% of a DPS for free.
Yeah,
it's so hard to beat that.
All right, cool. That's 10 man 25 in order. So you've played all the healers. So for someone who's not actually bothered about necessarily being the meta healer, or maybe they're just doing sort of celestials and they're doing casual raiding, not taking it super serious, what would you say is the most fun healers to play in order out of them?
Yeah, I think this is actually kind of a hard order to make because it's going to very much depend if you like the damage to healing playstyle. If you like the damage to healing playstyle, Mistweaver is like top of the list, I think, and Disc is also like probably second. But if you don't like that like atonement, being in melee, spamming damage playstyle, then those go down a lot. But I think Mistweaver is probably number one. I think number two is pretty close. I think if you're more of the typical standard healer player, I think Resto Druid's actually really fun. You have a lot of like cool utility you can do. Your basic, just the evergreen Druid gameplay of like spamming wild growth and rejuve. I don't know why it's so fun, but it just personally I find that super fun. I think Disc is like third, especially with the new changes. Previously, it was kind of just you AFK smite every global, which is not that fun. But now that you have to make more active choices of like optimizing your HPS a little bit more, doing a little bit more defensiveness, I think Disc is like up there. I put HPAL fourth. I think HPAL, like at its base, it's like a 3 or 4 button healer, but there's a lot of really cool, like it's high APM, right? You're always spamming, you're generating a bunch of holy power, dumping it into really powerful spenders. You can micromanage your beacon in MOP with the beacon glyph, which is super fun in my opinion. And now that its mana is super easy, it's just gonna feel like amazing to play, I think. But again, it does lose points if you don't like being in melee. H-Priest is probably like the second to last one. I think it's super fun in PvP, but in PvE, again, you're just going to be in your AoE stance. You're going to be spamming Circle of Healing and Palm and Prayer of Healing. So if you like that, then it's fun, but it is a little bit kind of generic in my view. Although the Chakra cooldown stuff, being able to go into red and damage, it makes it a little bit more fun in my opinion. And definitely last place for me is Shaman. I think we'll probably share this opinion. Shaman is just like, it's kind of low APM. It's very like relaxed. So you kind of have a lot of downtime where you're just spamming Lightning Bolt. And so much of your healing just comes from like putting your healing rain down and then putting Riptide up. It just feels like kind of it's like a very low energy play style in my view. So that's my ranking. But again, like all these specs are fun. There's no like big stinker in my view.
Other than Resto Shaman.
And so much quality of life. Well, yeah. I mean, but even Resto Shaman it's way more fun in MOP than it is in Kata, in my view. Because so much of the healers, they get all these nice quality of life changes and stuff that remove a lot of the pain points. So even the worst ones are still like pretty fun.
Yeah, I struggled while you was going through that because I kept changing my mind as I'm listening to you. I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'd put that second.
Basically, my list was Shaman pegged at the bottom, and then I was like, how do I do the top 5? Like I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. Like for me personally, Mistweaver would be number one, but that's just because it's so unique. There's nothing like it. Like it plays like no other healer plays. So that would be number one. But again, if you're that more old school healer where you're not really that bothered about doing damage, maybe you like to weave a little bit of damage in as the raid leaders call in that berserks in 30 seconds, then I would actually say Resto Druid for that sort of person. I have a lot of fun on a Resto Druid. I think a Resto Druid is really, really versatile, and if you was to run something like Heart of the Wild, so you can actually do some damage during, like damage amp, for example, on Windlord when it's taking 600% more damage, pop in Heart of the Wild and just pumping the boss. The addition of Mushroom and then being able to bloom it. And I really, really enjoy Resto Druid. And I love the fact that, you're into 100% of your intellect it goes as agility. So actually you can gain cat form and do a reasonable amount of damage as well. The fact that you've got an atonement option, so you can run Dreamer Cenarius, and your Wrath heals like a Disc Priest Smite would. I think a Resto Druid is literally like a Swiss Army knife of healers. It's got like a little bit of everything. You could almost say the Mushroom is like Healing Rain. You can almost say running Dreamer Cenarius is like a Disc Priest. You can almost say it's a bit like Fist Weaving, because you can go cat and you've got all that agility and you've got decent cat moves still, as in abilities still. Unfortunately, none of it translates to healing like a Mistweaver does. So it's like it does a little bit of everything, but ultimately it comes down to you. So I think if you're the sort of person that wants to be really high APM, really active, using every global, a Resto Druid, you can play it that way. Or you can just play it as maintaining your hots, keeping your mushroom down, sort of stood there chilling, watching your mana go back up. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. The more I talk about Resto Druid, the more it makes me want to actually play mine. So yeah, I would say Mistweaver number 1, Druid number 2 / number 1 if you're not really into the whole being a Fist Weaver. I would then probably say Holy Paladin next, because I like, outside of the healer and just healing, I do like the utility of a Paladin. I like being able to use the whole toolkit. You can see the difference, the impact of a good Holy Paladin versus a bad Holy Paladin. A bad Holy Paladin might out-heal. It might do more HPS than the good Holy Paladin. But the good Holy Paladin was looking and, putting Hand of Sack on the tank when it was called for, putting, Hand of Protection on people, using Devotional at the right time. There's a lot to a Holy Paladin, especially now you can get up in melee and actually do some damage, and you're getting mana back. Your mana is not quite as harsh as it was before these changes. Yeah, I would put Holy Paladin next. Then I would put Disc Priest. Yeah, it would be Disc Priest next. I've always raided on a Disc Priest, so I've played. Well, when I say always, that's an exaggeration. I've raided as a Disc / Shadow Priest since Ulduar in Wrath, and I've kept my priest up to date, since then. So I've raided all through Kata. Yeah, half of Wrath, and I find Disc very boring, me personally. Very rotational almost. You're just waiting for a bit when big damage is about to come in, and then you're using Archangel and spamming Prayer of Healing, and then outside of that you're doing Atonement. I know that changes a lot. Well, not a lot. It changes a reasonable amount in MOP, where you've now got Spirit Shell, but you're still kind of doing the same thing. Your Atonement in, and then you're still doing that, big damage is about to come in. I'm going to start Prayer of Healing everyone with Archangel up. But now you're just doing it with Spirit Shell active instead. I'm not, dooming on Disc Priest. They're absolutely fine. It's just not really a playstyle that gets me excited. And then the bottom two, we can say Resto Shaman and Holy Priest for me, because Holy Priest I just literally have played nothing of since TBC. The last time I played a Holy Priest was TBC, where I was, Circle of Healing spamming pretty much on cooldown. That was the whole playstyle. And Resto Shaman.
Not too much different in MOP, honestly.
Oh, is it not?
COH thing. Except COH now Smart Heal, so you don't even have to target it. You just press the button and send the healing out into the ether.
Oh, that's even better. Yeah. Oh, maybe I will play it. That seems like the perfect spec to play while, getting hammered and raiding. But Resto Shaman, I dread in even in Dragon Soul when we're not now, but when we was 3 healing Spine and Madness, I was the Ellie Shaman that went Resto, and even in Kata, it's just the most boring spec. Exactly how you said. Apart from it's a little bit more boring because you get conductivity, so you're just putting Healing Rain down and it's lasting a lot longer, which means you can press Lightning Bolt a lot more. It's not for me. Resto Shaman's never been for me. I've played it out of necessity, but I would never say that it's a fun spec. So top 3, 100% for me would be Mistweaver, Resto Druid, and Holy Pally. And then what do we have next? Easiest healers to get started with. This is quite an interesting question because it depends what angle you're going to come at it from. Whether it's just is it easy, just rotationally, button wise, or like I said about Holy Paladin. Ultimately, Holy Paladin, in my opinion, is not a hard healer to play. But I think the complexity comes around utilizing the whole toolkit. So, like, what would you say if someone's brand new to healing? They're coming to play Mr. Pandaria. They haven't played, maybe since Wrath or something like that. What are the easiest to hardest healers to play?
I think Shaman is probably number one. It's powerful, but it also has like a super low floor where as long as you get your healing rain right and you press your Riptide on cooldown, you're doing great healing. And it's very hard to mess up. You just press your healing stream totem every once in a while. Again, it's very like low APM and pretty relaxed playstyle. You have a lot of time to think about what you're going to do. And the other thing that I want to mention here is that your cooldowns are really easy to use. Like there actually is some distinction here, right? Where like just pressing a healing tide totem, all you have to do is you just macro it in with your Ellie Master and your Berserk. You press your healing tide totem. That totem, that one global, will just solo a damage mechanic. And you don't have to do anything. You can AFK. You don't even have to press chain heal or spam because the cooldown is so powerful. And you just press one global or something like Holy Paladin, right? When your Holy Paladin presses their cooldowns, it's Wings, it's, Holy Avenger. They actually have to do their rotation correctly inside of that cooldown to generate a bunch of healing. It's not just one global that does everything for you. And, something like Mistweaver has a similar problem, whereas, something like a Shaman or a Holy Priest, you press your Healing Tide Totem, you press your hymn, you just take your hands off the keyboard, you're channeling your hymn, the whole raid's immortal for 8 seconds. So those cooldowns are really hard to mess up, which I think is a big thing. So I think Shaman's number one. I think actually Holy Priest is like number 2 easiest. Again, if you just kind of sit there and press Palm, Prayer of Healing, and Circle of Healing, and then you press your Halo, your Divine Star on cooldown, just that, you're doing great healing. And again, your cooldowns are really easy to use. You just set your Lightwell down wherever you want, close to the raid. It's smart heals. You don't have to click it. It's just automatic. Him, you just press it, you channel. You're doing crazy healing. And so I think those are probably like the easiest, most approachable. Holy Priest is also like, it's very simple, right? It's very basic. It's sort of generic healer. Next, I think like Holy Paladin, Resto, Druid, and Disc Priest are all like pretty close in terms of difficulty. Where like at a baseline, just doing the basic stuff is not super hard, but there's a lot of like little min-maxy things that you can do, like Resto Druid, getting the most out of your Soul of the Forest. If you take tree form can be kind of intricate in how you use it. Holy Paladin, again, like you said, the basics of Holy Paladin are pretty simple, right? It's just you Radiance for AoE, you press your Divine Light for single target, you press your Holy Power Spenders. But especially with like all the stuff you can do with Beacon in this expansion, all the stuff you can do with Utility, I think the skill cap is like pretty high. Same thing with Discipline, right? Like the basics of just pressing Penance and Holy Fire and kind of spamming Smite and, pressing your Power Word Shield every now and again. Not super hard, but there's a lot of little things you can do with the spec. I think pretty solidly Mistweaver is like the least approachable. And it's because it has like a pretty unique playstyle compared to the other healers. And there's also a lot of things that if you do them wrong, you can really harm yourself. So casting your Rem, which is your main pot that spreads around the raid, casting that on cooldown very consistently is super important. If you like miss a cast, if you don't cast it for a certain amount of time, it can screw up your like ramp healing and your AoE healing. Using your Thunder Focus T, which resets your hots, like there's all these little things that you have to kind of be locked in on. And this was especially true before the mana changes. Now, after the mana changes, it's a lot more forgiving because you won't be ooming if you mess up. You'll just be doing less healing. So I think Mistweaver is like easier than it was pre these changes, but it's still probably like the top spec in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that order. Yeah, I've literally got nothing to add. Yeah, I think Resto Shaman definitely like far and away. It's amazing. It's amazing how easy it is to play.
Want to lean back in your chair with a beer in one hand and play, you have your Riptide bound to mouse wheel up, and you're healing rain bound to mouse wheel down. You play with one hand. Like on a shaman, you're cranking. You're just fine.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing how easy it is to play, but how how rewarding it is as well at the same time. Mistweaver, I think Mistweaver definitely is most challenging from a knowledge perspective as well. Not just the ability to play the class. Like you can be heavily hindered by lack of understanding of incoming mechanics as well. So not only are you having to look at everything that you said with renewing mists, going out on cooldown, making sure you time your Thunder Focus T. You're actually having to look at boss time, as I would say, as much as something like a Disc Priest. Disc Priest should be doing the same thing. Even a Resto Druid, to a certain extent, should be doing the same thing as well. Whereas the easier healers haven't got that level of preparation that they need to be putting in before mechanics come in. And then Holy Paladin, sits firmly in the middle, in between all of that as well. Just as it's not overly difficult to actually do the healing, but then being able to maintain that healing and getting melee, so you're getting the most out of your class and utilizing your toolkit. If anybody asked me what they should play, my answer would always be, for ease, Resto Shaman and Resto Druid. Because again, I think Resto Druid, even though it is more difficult, no doubt, it's more difficult than Resto Shaman. But I think you can kind of, there's no one way to play it, if you know what I mean. Like you can kind of get by playing it however you want, and you can go for the easier talent choices, like you said with Soul of the Forest. As long as you're pressing Wild Growth after you've Swift Mended, so you've got it haste buffed. Like there's little things that you can min max, but ultimately, I think a Resto Druid's quite a good place to start as well, and there's a lot of growth potential there. Whereas Resto Shaman, there's not a lot you can do to get better. A Resto Druid, I think, is quite new player friendly, but you will grow into the class as well.
Yeah, it's an important thing to mention at the very end here, just super quickly, which is that, like you said, a lot of these specs, you can take talent choices, and usually they're not too much of a loss. Like you can take the passives, you can take the less involved abilities, and you can choose to play all these healers in a way that's like pretty relaxed and pretty easy if you want to, just to go through a normal and smash it out or whatever. If you're just playing for fun with the boys, like there are builds you can take with most of the healers that are just super relaxed.
Cool. Have you got anything else that you want to add? Because everything's ticked off on my list. We managed to weave in very strategically the both movie quotes. So for anyone who's watching, if you didn't notice them, you might want to go back and watch this all again. Unlucky. And anything from you, Tom?
I think we covered everything. It was pretty exhaustive. I tried not to ramble too much, but it's just my nature. I can't help it.
All right. Well, do you want to tell everyone where they can find you, and also like what to expect? Obviously, we're getting very close to the pre-patch, and then we ain't got long till launch. Like, what are your plans video-wise for over the next few weeks?
Yeah, I'm just Doublezug on YouTube. I mostly make healer-focused content, and I'm trying to come out with like the full in-depth full in-depth spec guides for every healer before pre-patch, but it's getting pretty close now, so I should have like a few guides out before then. But I am going to do guides, in-depth, like full guides for every single healer spec, and then I do like healer-focused boss tips and strategies and stuff like that as well. So you're interested in that,
I'll put a link in the description so everyone can go and show you some love, and I would encourage absolutely everybody to go and do that. Right, okay, well, hopefully everybody enjoyed that, took something away from it, whether you're new to healing, an experienced healer. That's all the changes. That's both of our opinions on easiest healers to play, where to start, what we think is going to be overpowered in 10 and 25 man. Hopefully you found both of the movie quotes. So I'll say goodbye, and then Doublezug.
Goodbye. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, and thank you for joining me, mate. It's been a lot of fun. I'll see you on the next one.
Yeah, it was great.